How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylei Hobby Time. A little over a year ago, I bought my first model train. It was this one right here. Technically, it was in a smaller scale, but it was the same train from my home state of Colorado. I customized that original N-scale train and threw it in my Desert Canyon layout, but the train itself was pretty tiny, and I want to make a new train that I could add a little bit more detail to. So this time around, I got the bigger one. Today I'm going to take these train cars apart and customize each of them. I'll be adding some heavy weaponry and repainting the cars to look less out of place in a gritty Wild Western fantasy story, or as I've been referring to it, the Wild Imaginary West. When I'm done, I want this train to look and function like a fortress on wheels, one that's carving its way through this Wild West with the brute force of steam and iron. The first thing to do was to move the train over to my workbench and begin the disassembly. Before I begin, I'd like to show you all this awesome cryptid microfiber cloth that Studson's studio picked up for me in Japan. He also sent me some emergency crafting supplies as well. Thanks, man. In order to detach the engine from the tender, I unclipped the wires that were connecting the two. Next, I removed some screws in order to get the boiler separated from the wheels. This engine is a 280, meaning it has 2 leading wheels, 8 driving wheels, and 0 training wheels, just like me as of last week. Next, I took apart the tender. I'm going to be doing some weathering on these bad boys, so I also added some masking tape to all the places that I didn't want my paint or washes to go. After the engine and tender, I moved my way down the train, detaching the carriage of each car from the chassis and trucks. I also removed the roofs. Some were attached with screws, others had tabs that needed to be pried away in order to release, but all of them were fairly easy to take apart except the last one, which was glued, so I had to use some nippers to take care of that. Just as a general warning, all these customizations are permanent, and it would be impossible to get everything back to its original state. So, before you go attempting anything like this with your own personal belongings, make sure you're okay with the possibility of ruining it. I made a quick sketch of the train cars as they looked originally, and then I drew some concepts for the changes that I wanted to make. This first car is the main passenger car with a machine gun deck with multiple machine guns and a large swiveling cannon in the middle. It may seem counterintuitive, but one good way to lessen the chances of you cutting your own fingers is to start with a nice sharp blade. More sharpness means less force, which means better control. I also like to throw some tape over the cutting edge of my old blades before I throw them away. For the new hardtop that will go on 2 of these train cars, I cut up some 040 styrene. All you need is a score line, and it will snap cleanly and satisfyingly along that line. To give the top a little more height, I built some frames from square styrene rods which I matched to the size of the roof. I enjoyed cleaning up these little seam lines which needed to be removed in order for the styrene to sit flush. I used plastic cement to bond all of the plastic pieces together cleanly and permanently. With plastic cement, I've found that a little bit of force helps bond the pieces a little faster. For the cannon, which might be better classified as a howitzer, I used the barrel of a Gundam beam rifle. I kit bashed it with some other model kit bits, I put it on some gears and then on a wargaming base so that it looked like it could rotate 360 degrees. I made some armored metal walls to go on the top of the car, and I glued those in place with enough room to mount the cannon in the middle. After gluing the machine guns in place, I cut up some wire mesh. I glued that to the interior of the train cars behind the windows to reinforce the windows. After that, I finished it up with an assortment of greeblies on the top of the car to give it some detail and life. Next up was the worst drawing of a railgun that I've ever drawn. That little black thing on top is supposed to be the railgun. In addition to the railgun, I added some smaller turrets that can fire down the side of the train, aiming at any critters like chupacabras that might be clinging to the side. The railgun is made from a Gundam bazooka with some added mechanical pieces as well as a little barrel extension on the end. I added some open railing along the top of this one to display that nice railgun, which looked far better than my drawing of that railgun. Before moving to the last car, I threw a machine gun on the back of the tender as well. I made it from a Gaslands flamethrower that I clipped the barrel off of, and I made a new barrel from some tiny brass tubes from K&S Precision Metals. And once that had been mounted in place, I moved on to the last car. I wanted the last car to be a little supply and materials car, full of railroad ties, track sections, and a little crane hoist. I made the crane from Lunar Lander model kit pieces, and I threw a tiny hook on the end. I glued some crates and other storage units to the bed as well. For the railroad ties, I grabbed some balsa wood that was the right thickness, and I cut up a bunch of beam sections to the same length, and I glued them in 2 piles in the center of the car. I used some appropriately sized styrene rods as railroad track, and after adding a winch and cable to the crane, the kit bashing portion of this build was done. After cleaning up my workspace, I took the cars outside and I primed them. I used a black primer, and I also decided to use a sponge painting method that I've seen Squidmar use in a few of his videos. While I'm painting, I'd like to do a little bit of world building. I'd also like to give a huge shout out to all of my patrons as well. In case you haven't seen any of my previous Wild Western videos, in this version of the Wild West, there are large and aggressive monsters that roam the land. The natives have learned to navigate around these monsters and use clever skills to avoid them. Cowboys, miners, outlaws, and everyday settlers use special machines called forestalls to keep the monsters away, but the railroad has chosen a different approach. The railroad uses its abundance of resources, manpower, and heavy weaponry to fight its way across the West with little regard for anything or anyone that stands in their way. While their heavy weapons make them practically unbeatable in the plains, tight winding canyons drastically reduce their range and visibility. Tunneling is also immensely dangerous due to what you might unearth, making the Rockies a formidable obstacle in their race to the west coast. It has basically slowed them down to a standstill. Even so, the railroad refuses to use forestalls, and I'll explain that more in a future video. After all of the painting was done, I carefully reassembled the train. After screwing and snapping everything back together that needed to be screwed and snapped back together, I added some finishing touches like a wash over the bright yellow handrails to bring down the saturation. The last thing to do was to put the train cars back on the train track, and after that, I called it good. Before moving on to my glamour shots, please take a moment to appreciate all these beautiful projects made by my patrons for the monthly art challenge. The art challenge was planes, trains, and rockets, and I think they did a great job. Huge thank you to all of the patrons who participated in last month's art challenge. So, as you can see, the customization of the train is done and it looks pretty fun, but this board and layout is not so fun, which means I need to make another layout. You'll see that soon. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.